My name is Miriam Cole. I am 44 years old, and I work with broken things for a living. That is not entirely accurate, but it is the version I give at dinner parties when someone asks what a museum conservator does, and their eyes are already beginning to glaze. The more accurate version is this. I assess objects of cultural significance, paintings, sculptures, textiles, works on paper, and I determine what has happened to them over time, what damage is real and what is surface, what can be repaired and what must simply be understood and stabilized, because some things cannot be restored to what they were, and the most honest thing you can do is acknowledge that and protect what remains. I have been doing this work for 19 years. I am, in the careful language of my field, well regarded. I say this not to impress you, but because it is relevant context for understanding why what happened in my marriage is the kind of damage I should have been able to see coming, and why I did not, and what that particular blindness cost me. I want to start at the gala. The Harrington Foundation benefit is held every November at the Alderton Museum, which is the institution I have directed for the past 14 months. It is a significant evening, the kind where a room that normally holds paintings holds also the people who fund their acquisition, and the two populations must be successfully introduced to each other for another year to proceed. 400 guests. Champagne that costs more per glass than most people's lunch. The particular social physics of wealthy rooms, where everyone is performing their net worth at a slightly elevated register, the way you'd tune a string instrument up a half step for an outdoor venue to account for the ambient noise. I had been preparing for this event for 6 weeks. My assistant director, a young woman named Priya, who is organized in the way of someone who was born with an internal spreadsheet, had managed the logistics with the precision I relied on her for. The catering, the program, the seating, the silent auction, all of it handled. My contribution, in the final days, had been the welcome remarks, which I had written and rewritten until they were honest without being sentimental and warm without being performative, which is the only register I know how to occupy in a room that contains cameras. I was standing near the entrance when Daniel arrived. I saw him before he saw me, which is the only advantage I had that evening, and I used it the way I use every few seconds of unobserved time when something difficult is about to happen. I simply breathed and let my face settle into the expression of a woman who is exactly where she is supposed to be, because I was. He had not changed significantly. This is the first thing you look for, I think, when you see an ex-husband in a room, whether time has landed on him the way it lands on everyone else, or whether his particular brand of charm has somehow insulated him against it. Daniel Cole at 48 looked approximately as he had at 45, which is to say, well, the gray at his temples had advanced, which suited him in the way gray tends to suit men who understand it as an aesthetic asset rather than a concession. He was wearing a suit I did not recognize, which told me that Sophia had been shopping with him, or, for him, which was its own kind of information. Sophia was beside him. She was, as she had been in every photograph I had allowed myself to examine during the first 3 months after the divorce, beautiful in the uncomplicated way of someone young enough not to have accumulated the kind of experience that complicates beauty. 29 now, perhaps 30. She wore a dress that her own social media following would discuss tomorrow in the comments, because Sophia had 200,000 people who followed her life as aesthetic content, and Sophia's life had become, since she entered it, the primary subject of Daniel's. They were checked in at the door. I watched the moment, brief, a half second, when Daniel looked up from the check-in table and found me in the entrance hall. And his face did what faces do when they encounter something they had prepared a different version of. I was wearing black. I have worn black to professional events since I was 26, because black in a museum context communicates that you understand you are not the object of interest. The art is a philosophy I hold genuinely, and find also, as a practical matter, useful. But the black I wore that evening was not the practical black of someone who has chosen a color by default. It was a dress I had bought 3 months after the divorce, at the specific invitation of a friend who had said to me, gently but with force, "You are about to become a museum director. Dress like you already are one." I had tried on 7 dresses. I had bought this one because when I put it on, the woman in the mirror looked like someone who had decided something rather than someone who was still deciding. Daniel looked at me across the entrance hall of my museum, and I saw him recalculate. I walked toward them because the alternative, remaining where I was, letting the moment announce itself, was not in my character. I am a woman who moves toward difficult things, in my professional life and in my personal one, because I have learned that the difficulty does not diminish with distance. It only becomes more difficult to approach. "Daniel," I said, "I'm glad you could make it." He smiled, the smile that had once, I should tell you, been one of my favorite things about him, the particular warmth of it, the way it engaged his whole face. "Miriam." He leaned in for the social kiss, the kind you give professional acquaintances at events, and I accepted it with the same calibration. "This is extraordinary. The museum looks incredible." "Thank you," I said. "We've had a good year." I looked at Sophia. She had the expression of a woman who has been briefed on a situation and is managing her performance of it carefully. I give her credit for that. It was not easy, and she was not making it worse. "Sophia," I said, "it's nice to meet you properly." I had seen her only in photographs until that moment. "You too," she said, and her voice was genuine in the way of someone who has not yet learned to make it otherwise, which I found, unexpectedly, not unpleasant. "Enjoy the evening," I said. "I'll be giving remarks at 8. Please find your seats by 1:45. And then I moved on, because I had 400 guests and 2 hours of hosting ahead of me, and Daniel Cole, whatever else he had been, was now simply a guest who had purchased a table, and guests are treated with the same warmth as everyone else in the rooms I manage. I want to go back now, because the gala makes less sense without the marriage, and the marriage makes less sense without the years that led me to Daniel in the first place. I met Daniel Cole at a gallery opening when I was 31 and he was 35. He was in finance, investments, specifically, the management of other people's significant money in ways that required him to be present at the right events and know the right people and move through rooms with the ease of someone for whom rooms were simply environments to be navigated rather than challenges to be managed. He was good at this. It was the thing about him I admired most early, and the thing I understood last, that the ease came not from confidence, exactly, but from a very well-maintained performance of it, and that the maintenance of the performance required, at some point, an audience that reflected it back. We married when I was 33. I was, at that point, a senior conservator at the Alderton, not yet the director, not yet the person whose name appeared at the top of grant applications and institutional correspondence, but a person building towards something identifiable and real. The work I did in those years was some of the most significant of my career. I led the restoration of a major 17th century landscape that had been damaged in transit, a project that took 11 months and was written about in 3 journals and changed, in a small but measurable way, the field's approach to a specific category of paint degradation. Daniel came to the presentation of that restoration. He stood in the gallery and looked at the painting and then at me, and he said, with what I believed was genuine admiration, "You put that back together." And I said yes, and he said, "How do you know when you're done?" And I told him about the principle of reversibility, that in conservation, you only do what can be undone because the object's integrity matters more than your intervention, and every choice you make should be recoverable if a better approach is found later. He listened to all of this with the focused attention of a man who found it genuinely interesting, And I loved him for that. That evening, in the particular way you love someone who asks the right question. I should have paid more attention to whether he was still asking right questions a year later, 2 years, 5. The marriage was not violent, not catastrophically unhappy, not the kind of story I would tell with tears or with particular bitterness. It was the story of two people who had built a life around a set of assumptions that gradually revealed themselves to be misaligned, and who had, for reasons that are probably explicable by things each of us would need a therapist longer than I've had one to fully articulate, avoided examining the misalignment until it was structural. The assumption on my end that Daniel admired my work in the way that would translate over time into actual support of it, the logistical support, the domestic negotiation, the adjustments that a two-career household requires when one career begins to demand more than the other. The assumption on Daniel's end, and I understand this now with more clarity than I had during the marriage, partly through therapy and partly through the specific education of watching someone build a new relationship on the same foundation, was that I would eventually arrive at a version of professional success that felt like enough, that would allow me to modulate the ambition, to be present in the social dimensions of his life the way he needed me to be present. He wanted, I think, what he had seen in his mother's marriage. A capable woman who moved through the world with intelligence and competence and redirected those qualities at some point, primarily toward the construction and maintenance of a shared life. I was not going to arrive at that version of myself. It was not in me to arrive there. And somewhere around year 8 of the marriage, I think we both understood this, though neither of us said so, because saying so would have required us to name what we were going to do about it. What Daniel did about it, at 45, was Sophia Reyes. I will not dwell on the discovery, because the details are not the point, and they are mine. What I will tell you is that it did not happen the way it happens in films. There was no confrontational scene, no dramatic unmasking. It happened in the way most things happen in actual lives. Gradually and then, in a single conversation on a Tuesday evening in March, all at once. He sat across the kitchen table from me in the house we had shared for 11 years and told me, with a directness I had not anticipated and could not help respecting even in the moment of receiving it, that he had been seeing someone for 4 months, that he believed he was in love, and that he wanted to be honest with me rather than continue indefinitely in a situation that was not fair to either of us. I sat with this for what felt like a very long time and was probably 45 seconds. Then I said, "How old is she?" He told me. I did not respond to the answer because the answer at that moment was information I needed to store but not process. I had 30 years of professional training in managing the impulse to respond immediately to damage before you understand the full extent of it, and I applied it then. I asked him to give me a few days to think about the practical dimensions. He said, "Of course." I went to my study, closed the door, and allowed myself exactly 1 hour of feeling everything at once, which I have found, in my life, to be the most efficient approach to overwhelming emotion. Not suppression, but a contained and deliberate engagement with it, after which I can return to function. At the end of the hour, I made a list. Lawyer, lease, finances, colleagues I needed to tell before they heard elsewhere, my therapist's number, which I had not used in 2 years and needed to use now. The divorce took 7 months and was conducted, on both sides, with the controlled professionalism of two people who had agreed that dignity was the one thing they owed each other after everything else had been determined. I do not say this to suggest it was painless. It was not painless. There were nights, in the apartment I moved to after the house was listed. A small, well-lit place near the museum that I had rented specifically because it was close enough to work that I could walk there at 6 in the morning when sleeping had become impossible. There were nights in that apartment when I sat with the particular weight of 11 years concluding and felt it as a physical pressure, something just below the sternum that did not quite resolve into anything actionable. But I went to work. I want that on the record clearly, because it is the thing I am most grateful for. Not that I held myself together, which implies a kind of brittle maintenance that was not what it was, but that I went to work, and the work held me. Conservation work is the right work to do when your life has been significantly altered, because it asks you, every day, to sit with a damaged object and understand it without rushing the understanding, to resist the impulse to impose a resolution before you know what you are actually dealing with. I spent those months assessing a collection of photographs that had been damaged in a climate control failure. I processed samples, I documented, I made careful, reversible interventions, and the work did what good work does. It required my full attention, which is the most complete form of temporary mercy I know. 4 months after the divorce was finalized, I was offered the directorship of the Alderton. I had applied for this position once before, 3 years earlier, and been passed over. The board at that time had cited, in the careful language of an institution managing a rejection, my relative youth and what they called evolving institutional priorities, a phrase that means nothing and therefore means everything the person saying it needs it to mean. I had been disappointed in the specific way of someone who had expected to be further along, and I had returned to my conservation work and tried to understand what I needed to develop. What I learned, 14 months into the directorship, was that I had not needed to develop anything. What had changed between my first application and my second was not my qualifications. Those had been sufficient in both cases. What had changed was a single board member. His name was Arthur Cleave. He had been on the Alderton board for 20 years and had voted against me in the first round, and when I sat down with him in my first month as director, a courtesy meeting, introductory, the kind you have with board members to establish working relationships, he said something that I have returned to more times than I can count. He said, "I want to be straightforward with you, Miriam, because I think you deserve straightforwardness. When you applied 3 years ago, I had a conversation with your husband at a benefit event. He spoke about your work with considerable admiration. He also said, and I am telling you this because I believe you should know it, that you were in the early stages of reconsidering your career trajectory, that you were giving serious thought to moving away from institutional leadership toward private practice, and that the timing might not be ideal." He paused. I passed that information to 2 other board members. It influenced the vote. I sat very still. "He never told me that," I said. "No," Arthur said. "I assumed, when you reapplied, that circumstances had changed." I thanked him for telling me. I kept my expression neutral and my voice level, and I shook his hand at the end of the meeting and walked to my office and closed the door, and stood at the window for a long time, looking at the courtyard below, where a gardener was raking the edge of the lawn with particular care. Here is what I decided to do with that information. I decided to use it as data. Not as a wound, not as a revelation requiring dramatic response, but as a piece of data that clarified something I had been trying to measure for years, the actual nature of what Daniel had called support. I had believed, for 11 years, that what he felt for my work was admiration. I understood now that what he had felt was something more complicated than admiration and less honest than opposition. He had wanted me to succeed in the abstract while protecting himself from the specific consequences of my actual success. And he had done so when the opportunity presented itself, at a cocktail party, in a single conversation that I had not known happened and therefore could not refute. I did not confront Daniel with this. It was over. The marriage was over. The vote had been taken 3 years ago and could not be revised. What I could do was be the director I had always been qualified to be, in the institution I had always belonged in, and let the work speak for itself in the rooms where speaking happened. By the night of the Harrington benefit, I had been director for 14 months. In those 14 months, the museum had acquired a collection of early modernist works that had been in a private estate for 60 years and were now accessible to the public for the first time. We had completed a conservation lab expansion that allowed us to take on research partnerships with 2 universities. We had increased attendance by 31% through a programming shift I had advocated for since before the directorship. More community access, more educational engagement, the understanding that a museum's collection matters in direct proportion to the number of people who encounter it. The board had, at the last quarterly meeting, approved a capital campaign I had been preparing since month 3. I was not unaware that Daniel would encounter this when he arrived at the gala. I had not arranged it for that reason. The gala had been scheduled since July. Daniel had purchased his table in August, and I had noted the registration without taking any action regarding it because I am a director and he was a paying guest, and the professional obligation does not bend for the personal history. But I was not unaware. I gave my remarks at 8 o'clock. I do not reproduce speeches in full, as a rule. They belong to the moment they were delivered, and a speech on a page is a husk of a speech in a room. But I will tell you the part I had rewritten most, because it is the part that mattered most, and I want to be accurate about what I actually said. I talked about what a museum is for. I said that a museum is, at its simplest, a building that says, this thing has value, and the value is not contingent on the market, and the value is not contingent on popularity, and the value exists even when the thing is damaged, even when the thing is incomplete, even when the thing is currently in a climate-controlled drawer, being evaluated by someone with a magnifying glass and a patience measured in years. I said that conservation, which is my own background, teaches you that the damage is not the definition, that a painting is not its water stain, that a bronze is not its patina, that an object can carry a century of mishandling and still be, underneath the accumulation, exactly what it was when it was made, and that the work of the institution is to see through the accumulation to the thing itself, and to say clearly, this is what we have. This is worth preserving. This is worth your time. I paused for a moment. Then I said, I think that's also what the people in this room are doing when they show up for this institution year after year. You are saying that something has value even when the world is noisy about other things. That act of sustained attention, of continuing to show up, is itself a form of conservation. And it is why this museum exists, and why it will continue to exist, because of rooms like this one, and people like you, who keep saying, this is worth it. The room applauded. The room always applauds at this kind of event, because applause is part of the social contract. But this applause had a quality to it that I had learned to distinguish from obligatory applause. It was sustained a beat longer, and it came from a room that had been genuinely quiet while I was speaking, which is the only reliable measure of whether a room was actually listening. I stepped down from the podium and found Priya at my elbow with a water glass, because Priya anticipates every requirement before I have articulated it. That was the best one, she said. It was the most honest one, I said. Daniel found me 40 minutes later near the East Gallery, where a Rothko we had recently restored was on display for the first time in 8 years. He came alone. Sophia was somewhere in the room. I had noted her earlier near the silent auction tables, engaged in conversation with someone whose work she was probably filming for her following. He stood beside me, looking at the Rothko for a moment. This is something he had always known how to do. Stand with a painting, let the silence be comfortable rather than awkward. It was one of the things, in the early years, that had made me believe we understood each other. Miriam, he said, that speech was extraordinary. Thank you, I said. I mean it. The room was completely with you. I noticed, I said. He was quiet for a moment. The Rothko held its particular quality of light, the warm burgundy field, the floating forms, the sense of something just beyond resolution. I had spent 6 months with this painting, assessing and treating its surface, and I could see, at a glance, every intervention I had made and every decision I had deferred. When you know a work that well, looking at it in a public room has a specific quality. You are always seeing both the painting and the record of everything you understood about it. "I owe you something," Daniel said. I turned to look at him. He was looking at the painting. "Arthur Cleeve told you," he said. Not a question. "He told me," I said. A pause. "When did he tell you?" "Month 1. He absorbed this. I watched him absorb it, and I want to be honest about what I felt watching it. Not satisfaction, not the particular pleasure of someone whose pain has been validated at last. Something more neutral, the feeling of a measurement confirming a hypothesis you would rather had been wrong. "I didn't," he started. "You don't need to explain it," I said. "I understand it." "That's not the same as forgiving it." "No," I said. "It isn't." He finally turned from the painting to look at me. He had the expression of a man doing something genuinely difficult, which I recognized because I had seen it from him rarely and always appreciated when it arrived. "I think I was afraid of it," he said, "of what it would mean if you got that job when we were still married. What it would mean for the shape of things." "The shape of things," I said. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds like you made a decision about my career in a private conversation that I wasn't part of, and then continued for 3 years as though it hadn't happened," I said. My voice was even. I was not performing evenness. I had arrived, after 14 months, at an actual evenness, the kind that comes not from suppressing feeling, but from having processed it sufficiently that it no longer requires active management. He looked at me for a long moment. "You're not angry," he said. He sounded surprised. "I was," I said. "For about 4 months. It was very efficient anger. I've moved on to the directorship." He almost smiled. Then, "Are you happy? Here, in this, in what you've built?" I considered the question, because it deserved to be considered. I looked around the East Gallery, the Rothko, the 2 Diebenkorn landscapes recently hung to its left, the visitors circulating with champagne glasses, the low sound of a string quartet from the main hall, Priya visible through the archway managing something with her characteristic quiet competence. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," I said. "Which is not the same thing as happy, exactly. It's better than happy. It's accurate." He nodded. Then, "I should have said this a long time ago, in a different room. I'm sorry, Miriam, not for the marriage ending. I think the marriage had run its honest distance. But for that conversation with Arthur, that was wrong, and it was small, and you deserved better." I looked at him. "I know you mean that," I said. "I do." "Then I'll accept it," I said. "Not because it changes anything that's already happened, but because you meant to say it and you said it, and that counts for something." We stood there for another moment, 2 people looking at a painting that had been damaged and restored, and was now, in a well-lit room, being seen clearly for possibly the first time in decades. There was something in that which I did not say aloud, because the metaphor was too obvious, and I have a professional allergy to obvious metaphors, but I noticed it. "Sophia seems kind," I said. I said it because it was what I had observed, and because it was true. He looked slightly surprised. "She is," he said. "Then I hope you are good to her," I said. "In the specific ways you were not good to me, the ways that matter, the private ones." He was quiet. "I'm trying to be," he said. I nodded. Then Priya was at my elbow with the expression of someone who has identified a situation requiring my attention, and I excused myself, and that was the last substantive conversation Daniel Cole and I had that evening. He and Sophia left around 10, and I saw him pause at the door and look back at the room once, the sweep of a man taking in something he understood, perhaps for the first time, he no longer had access to. Not the room exactly, the version of me in it. Let me tell you about what happened after the evening, because I think the after matters as much as the event. The morning after the gala, I arrived at the museum at 7, because I arrive at the museum at 7 every day, which is the actual shape of my life, and which I love unreservedly. Priya had left a summary of the silent auction results on my desk, a clean glass of water and a note that said, "The Rothko made 3 people cry. Overheard at least 2 significant donation conversations. You were wonderful." I read this, put it in my desk drawer, and went to the lab. I was in the middle of assessing a small panel painting that had arrived the week before. A 15th century work in uncertain condition, provenance complicated, surface losses significant. When my phone rang, it was a number I did not recognize, and I would normally have let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. It was a woman named Cassandra Vane, who identified herself as the executor of the estate of a collector named Bernard Holloway, who had died 6 weeks earlier. She said she had attended the gala the previous evening, heard my remarks, and wanted to discuss the potential donation of a significant portion of the Holloway collection to the Alderton, the Holloway collection. If you work in American art, that name has a specific resonance. Bernard Holloway had spent 60 years assembling what many considered the most important private collection of mid-century American works outside of major institutional holdings. It had been assumed, since his death, that the collection would go to auction. I sat down in the lab, on a stool, still holding the magnifying loupe I had been using when the phone rang. "I would like very much to discuss that," I said. We met the following Thursday. The collection would take 18 months of negotiation, assessment, and legal coordination to finalize. It is, as of this morning, the largest gift in the Alderton's institutional history. When it opens to the public next fall, it will change what this museum is, not incrementally, but fundamentally, the way a building changes when you open a wall and discover the actual size of the room. I tell you this not to frame the gala evening as a transaction, as though Daniel's apology and Sophia's presence and the Rothko in the East Gallery were all steps toward a professional outcome. They were not. The professional outcome arrived from a woman who heard me talk about what a museum is for and decided she wanted her grandfather's life's work to live in a place that understood that question. The personal evening arrived from 11 years of a marriage and 14 months of a directorship, and one conversation near a painting that had been damaged and restored and was now, at last, in its right light. But I will say this. The evening clarified something for me that I had been measuring obliquely for over a year, the way you sometimes measure a work's condition through transmitted light rather than direct examination, seeing what it is by seeing what passes through it. I had spent 11 years with a man who loved me in the way of someone who needed me to be a specific version of myself, and who had, when the version I was becoming diverged from the version he needed, made a quiet decision to redirect that divergence. This was not evil. It was human, and limited, and wrong, and he had apologized for it in front of a Rothko at my museum at his ex-wife's professional gala, which is almost cosmically appropriate if you believe the universe has a sense of composition, which I do not, professionally, but which I am willing to entertain as a poetic principle. What I understood, standing in the East Gallery that evening, was that the version of myself I had protected, the one that kept going to work, kept taking the honest measurement, kept applying the reversible intervention and waiting to understand the damage before treating it. That version had not needed protecting. It had needed only time and the removal of the particular pressure that had been quietly, in a conversation at a cocktail party, applied to it. Remove the pressure, and the thing returns to its actual shape. That is the principle of conservation. That is also, it turns out, the principle of a life. I have been asked by people who know the basic outline of this story whether I found the gala satisfying in the way that implied stories of this kind are supposed to be satisfying. The ex-husband encountering the transported wife, the scales balanced, the wrongdoers reckoned. I understand the appetite for that version of events. It is a clean and emotionally efficient narrative. But that is not what the evening was, and I cannot tell it as though it were without falsifying it. The evening was not a reckoning. It was a sounding, the kind of measurement that tells you where the bottom is, finally, after a long time of not knowing. Daniel looked at me across the rooms of my museum and understood, I think, what he had done and hadn't done, and what those two things together had cost both of us. I stood in those rooms and understood that the cost had been real, and that I had paid it, and that what remained was solid enough to build on. Those are not the same thing as satisfaction. They are better than satisfaction. They are information. Information is what I work with. Information is what I trust. The panel painting I was assessing on the morning after the gala turned out to be, under examination, significantly more intact than its surface condition suggested. This happens frequently. Damage accumulates on the outermost layers, in the varnish, in the grime of centuries. And when you remove those layers carefully and honestly, you find what was always there underneath. The original, the made thing, the object itself. The assessment took 3 weeks. When I wrote my report, I said what I always say in cases like this, which is what is true. The condition is better than it appears. The losses are real, but not defining. The work is worth preserving. I signed the report, dated it, put it in the file. I do not know if Daniel changed after that evening. I am not the person to assess that. I am no longer the relevant observer of his condition. What I know is that he said something true at a Rothko, which is more than I had in 11 years, and that I received it without needing it to be more than it was, which is more than the Miriam of 11 years ago could have managed. What I know is that I walked out of my museum that night at 11 o'clock, when the caterers had finished, and the last guests had gone, and the paintings were alone in their galleries with the security lighting, and I stood for a moment in the entrance hall and looked at the building around me, the vaulted ceiling, the marble, the weight of an institution that had stood for 90 years and would stand for 90 more, and felt what I feel every time I stand in a museum at night after the public has left. The specific, reliable piece of a place that exists for something larger than any single person in it. Then I walked home through the November cold, past the lamplit streets and the dark gardens, to the small, well-lit apartment where nobody was waiting for me but the kettle and the stack of research files and the particular silence of a life that belongs entirely, at last, to itself. I made tea. I read for an hour. I slept without difficulty. In the morning, I went back to the museum. I went back to the work. The work was there, as it had always been, asking nothing of me except honesty and patience, and the willingness to sit with a damaged thing long enough to understand what it actually is. I have never found that to be too much to ask.